Nintendo was at their peak after the success of the NES and then continued success of the Super Nintendo. They had also dominated the handheld market with their series of Game Boy systems. The next home console needed to not only be impressive with its power, graphics, and games, but they needed to compete with the Sony PlayStation, which was released 2 years before the N64. Other systems were released at this time, such as the Sega Saturn, Sega 32X, Neo Geo CD, and the Atari Jaguar, but the PS1 was the only real competition the N64 would need to face. Originally, the Nintendo 64 went by the name Project Reality. Nintendo teamed up with Silicon Graphics to create what would eventually become the Nintendo 64. They promised graphics similar to the effects used in movies such as Terminator 2 and Jurassic Park, which unfortunately were simply not attainable for a game system of that time. A promotional marketing video was released for Project Reality. Let's take a look.
And with an eye to the future, tomorrow begins today. Nintendo, the world's leader in video games, has joined forces with Silicon Graphics, the world's leader in visual computing, to introduce the most exhilarating, breathtakingly realistic 3D video entertainment ever witnessed. Project Reality. Leagues beyond any currently available or anticipated hardware, Project Reality will bring to home video players the same types of astounding visual effects seen in movies, like Terminator 2 and Jurassic Park. When this technology is made interactive, players won't just watch their TV screens, they'll dive headfirst right through them.
A world that is like a dream come true, that sort of takes your imagination go way off.
Super duper sound, yeah, a lot of action, cool graphics.
That may have felt like the 21st century, but these phenomenal effects will be dazzling arcade game players this time next year. And by the end of 1995, Project Reality will be a reality to all home players as well. No other system will offer this dimension of realism. No other manufacturer can promise this scope of play. With this marriage of game-making expertise and technical wizardry, home video entertainment just took on a whole new dimension.
Sometime between 1993 and 1994, the name of the console was changed from Project Reality to Ultra 64. It was also in 1994 that Nintendo announced the media used for the games would be 100 megabyte cartridges instead of discs, even though multiple other game systems of that time period had already made the switch to using CDs for their games. This turned off a lot of third-party game developers from working with the system, because not only were CDs easier and cheaper to produce, but they could store a lot more data and were seen as the way of the future, which we now know to be true. Nintendo's somewhat correct defense for this choice was that cartridges didn't experience long load times like CDs, and their somewhat incorrect defense that cartridges were more practical. Cartridges may have been more practical for Nintendo at the time because they could easily enforce their licenses on the plastic shells and be the only supplier for game developers and publishers. However, they weren't practical for anyone else. Some people still prefer cartridges over discs for a variety of different reasons, but this seems to be one major mistake Nintendo made with the N64. In early 1995, Nintendo was supposed to unveil the Ultra 64, but this was delayed until November of that year, where it was set to be shown off at Shoshinkai, which was Nintendo's exhibition in Japan. At this unveiling, it was announced that the system was now called the Nintendo 64. People weren't too impressed at the exhibition, as only 2 of the 11 promised games were demoed to the public. Everyone seemed to be impressed by the graphics, but none of the games were even close to being finished, and with the system set to be released in less than a year from that point, people started to become skeptical if Nintendo could make the release date. In 1995, Nintendo showed a playable demo of Super Mario 64 at the Japanese trade show. The game was super impressive, and consumers were more excited than ever for the release of the Nintendo 64. Shigeru Miyamoto stated that he wanted to create a 3D Mario game for the Super Nintendo using the FX chip, while Nintendo was creating Star Fox. However, he instead moved the idea to the Nintendo 64 because the controller had more buttons, which would allow for a better gameplay experience. The Nintendo 64 was finally released on June 23, 1996 in Japan, September 26, 1996 in North America, and March 1, 1997 in Europe. Initially, the system was set to be released on September 30th in North America, but Nintendo announced in August that it would be released on September 29th, which was a Sunday. Their reasoning was that they didn't want anyone to miss school or work to get the system. They also announced that instead of the $299 price tag, it would release at $199, putting it in the same price bracket as the PS1 and Sega Saturn. Without permission from Nintendo, KB Toys released the system on September 26th, 2 days before it was supposed to be released, KB Toys being one of the largest toy retailers in the United States at that time. The system launched with only 3 titles, which is incredibly small for a launch lineup. Super Mario 64 and Pilot Wings 64 were the only games released worldwide, but a third game called Saikyu Habushogi, which was a virtual board game, was released only in Japan. Super Mario 64 was obviously the game of choice, and went on to sell about 11.89 million copies worldwide, positioning itself as the #1 best-selling Nintendo 64 game, with a lead of just over 2 million sold units over Mario Kart 64, which was released in December of 1996. Time magazine named the Nintendo 64 the Machine of the Year in 1996, and Nintendo apparently sold about 500,000 units in just the first 4 months after its release in the United States alone. 3.6 million units were sold in the United States after its first full year being released. Certain celebrities were reported to have called up Nintendo to try and get special treatment to get a system, as the demand was incredibly high and people were fighting over them in stores. The Nintendo 64 never outsold the PlayStation or even the Sega Saturn in Japan, but in North America it did outsell the Saturn. The decision to use cartridges instead of CDs resulted in the cost of new N64 games being higher than new games for competing systems. This, coupled with the fact that only 296 unique games were ever released in North America for the system, positioned the N64 in second place behind the PS1 in terms of system and game sales. While the Nintendo 64 was a success for Nintendo, there were a few major flaws that, if fixed, could have catapulted the N64 into first place. The Nintendo 64 was one of the first consoles to be released with an analog stick. Before this, gamers were used to using D-pads, or in some instances a joystick, similar to the Atari 2600s. The analog stick gave players control of a character in a fully 3D environment, which was unseen up until this point. Super Mario 64 was the perfect use of this analog stick, and the game's near-perfect control helped to solidify the absolute need for analog sticks on future controllers. Soon after this, Sony released the DualShock controller utilizing 2 analog sticks, and Sega released Nights into Dreams in Japan that was bundled with a 3D control pad, which incorporated an analog stick similar to the N64's. Sega's 3D control pad would later evolve into what became the Dreamcast controller, and Sony's DualShock controller design was of course carried on through each of their systems and even into the PS4, which shares a very similar setup to the original. All of these controllers owe their initial joystick design and concept to the Nintendo 64 controller. Even with the influential design and concept, the Nintendo 64 controller is hated by many gamers, mainly because of the awkward placement of the stick and D-pad, having 3 handles instead of 2 like most other controllers, and the unfortunate design of the control stick, which after prolonged use wears down and becomes loose. At this point, either the joystick or the controller must be replaced, as the actual plastic at the base of the stick shaves off and cannot be repaired. The original release of the system came in a standard black or gray color, with different color options available for the controllers. These original controller colors were available in gray, red, green, blue, black, yellow, and atomic purple. Nintendo would later release a line of colored systems known as the Fantastic series. These systems released in North America on March 6, 2000, and were available in Smoke Black, Fire Orange, Watermelon Red, Grape Purple, Ice Blue, and Jungle Green. Some of these systems were released in other parts of the world as well, some with different names. Matching controllers for these translucent systems were also released both as pack-ins with their matching systems and as standalone controllers. A few special edition or store exclusives were also released, including a gold system with matching controller at Toys R Us, an extreme green controller, which was a translucent neon green yellowish color, and some Japanese exclusive color schemes such as the Daiei Hawks, which is a clear orange on top and black on the bottom. There were many other limited colors, variants, special store releases, and bundles that were released, but there are too many to talk about each individually in this video. With the few faults of the system, the Nintendo 64 is still regarded as an innovative and important system. With its target audience now reaching their 20s and having disposable income, collecting for the system is rising in popularity and has been since about 2012. Currently, the Nintendo 64 along with the GameCube are two of the hottest systems to collect for, and prices have risen dramatically in the past few years. Many of the popular and fun games can still be had for relatively reasonable prices, such as Super Mario 64, The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, 007 GoldenEye, Super Smash Bros., Mario Kart 64, Banjo-Kazooie, and Pokémon Stadium. The many different color patterns and system bundles makes collecting for the N64 a long journey and gives collectors a lot of different items to strive for. These different controller and system colors and bundles makes up for the small library of games. Achieving a truly complete Nintendo 64 collection consisting of every game, system, controller, and accessory complete in their original boxes or sealed in some cases is a feat that nobody has completed yet. Many people have a full set of games or a full set of controllers, but nobody has collected every piece of Nintendo 64 history. There is always something new that's Nintendo 64 related to find, collect, play, or learn about. I hope you enjoyed this look at the history of one of the greatest systems of all time, the Nintendo 64. Thank you so much for watching, commenting, liking, and subscribing.